The quiet before the storm. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the wide, dusty plains in shades of burnt orange and purple. Sarah McCall stood on the porch of her small homestead, rocking gently in her chair as the evening breeze rustled the dry grass. She loved the quiet of this place, the endless sky, the smell of sagebrush, and the slow, peaceful rhythm of country life. After years of bustling towns and dusty trails, she had finally found her sanctuary here in the territory. Her husband, Jacob, was a man of steady hands and kind eyes. A blacksmith by trade, respected by all who knew him. Together, they had carved out a modest life, simple, honest, and safe. Sarah had learned to read the land, to sow, to cook meals from what the earth gave them. She was content. But peace, she would soon learn, was fragile. It started with the riders, strangers with hard faces and cold eyes. Rumors traveled fast in the territory, and when a small gang began stirring trouble nearby, the townsfolk whispered of rustled cattle and broken fences. Jacob had been wary, locking his workshop door a little tighter each night. But he never expected the violence to come to their doorstep. One evening, as the sky bled red and the cicadas sang their twilight song, the gang rode up to the homestead. They wanted to send a message to take what wasn't theirs and remind everyone who ruled these parts. Jacob met them with calm, his voice steady but firm as he told them to leave. The leader sneered, a cruel grin stretching across his face. The next moments came fast and brutal shots rang out. Horses reared, and in the chaos, Sarah's world shattered. She didn't see the bullet that found Jacob until it was too late. She could only hear his final words, whispered in the dust and wind. Protect this place. Protect yourself. When the riders finally left, the silence was heavy with loss. Sarah stood alone, the weight of grief pressing down on her chest. But buried beneath the pain was something fierce, a spark of resolve. The town saw her as vulnerable, a widow with no family, no allies. They thought she'd be easy to push around, easy to rob or threaten into submission. They thought wrong. That night, Sarah sat beside the cold embers of their fire and made a choice. The land was hers now, her home. She would not be a victim. She would not let fear rule her. The next morning, as dawn broke over the plains, Sarah rose with the first light. She pulled out her husband's old revolver from its hiding place beneath the floorboard. A relic she'd barely touched before. Now, it was a symbol, a promise to herself that she would survive, no matter what. Word spread quickly. The gang that had come and gone once began to test her resolve. Sending smaller groups to intimidate her, to steal her livestock, to scare her into leaving. But Sarah stood her ground. The territory was wild and unforgiving, but so was she. Testing the widow, the sun had barely climbed over the hills when the first threat came. Sarah was in the barn, feeding the few cattle left after the raid, when she heard the heavy stomp of boots on the porch. She froze, her heart pounding, then slowly turned to see 3 men standing in the doorway. Their faces were rough, shadowed by dusty hats pulled low. They wore the look of men who expected no resistance. Well, the tallest one drawled, spitting a wad of tobacco onto the dry dirt. A widow all alone. Thought you might be easy pickings. Sarah's hand went instinctively to the revolver tucked beneath her coat. This is my home, she said quietly but firmly. I don't take kindly to trespassers. The men laughed, a low, cruel sound. That's the spirit, said the second man, stepping closer. But spirits don't mean much round here without muscle. Sarah's eyes didn't waver. She remembered Jacob's words, the promise to protect, to survive. One of the men reached for his belt, and Sarah acted. The crack of her revolver echoed like thunder. The nearest man staggered, clutching his shoulder as he fell back, surprise and fear flickering across his face. The other 2 froze, then bolted, their boots kicking up dust as they fled across the yard. Sarah stood alone in the silence, her hand trembling but steady on the gun. She had done it. She had defended herself. But she also knew this was only the beginning. Word traveled fast through the dusty towns and saloons. Sarah McCall, the widow who shot first and asked questions later. The gang who'd ridden through the territory knew she wasn't the woman they'd thought to intimidate. They began sending more men, testing her defenses, probing for weakness. Some came under the cover of night, trying to steal cattle or set fire to her barn. Others confronted her openly, flashing weapons and sneering threats. But Sarah was ready. Each encounter sharpened her resolve. Each shot fired built her confidence. She began to train, rising before dawn to practice at makeshift targets. The revolver grew familiar in her hands. its weight a reminder of what she'd lost and what she intended to protect. The quiet widow was no longer quiet. In the towns nearby, whispers turned to talk, and talk turned to stories. People who once pitied Sarah now watched with wary respect. "You don't mess with the widow McCall," one barkeep muttered as he poured drinks. "She's got the fastest hand in these parts." Another added, tipping his hat. Sarah felt the weight of their eyes, the shifting tide of opinion. She wasn't just defending land anymore. She was carving a name. But with fame came danger. The gang's leader, a man known only as Crawford, wasn't one to back down. He sent word that Sarah should give up the homestead or face consequences far worse than lost cattle. Sarah knew the message was clear. They wanted her gone, and they weren't afraid to use force. That night, as the wind howled across the plains and the stars watched silently, Sarah sat by the fire. Her revolver lay on the table beside her, gleaming faintly in the fire. She thought of Jacob, the steady man who had believed in peace but prepared for war. She thought of the life they'd built and the life she would now fight to keep. A widow alone. That was what they thought. They didn't know the fire burning inside her fire that would make her the fastest gun in the whole territory. The first draw the sun was a cruel ball of fire beating down on the dry earth when the three riders appeared on the horizon, their dust clouds rising like ghosts in the afternoon heat. Sarah watched from the porch, her fingers resting lightly on the worn handle of her revolver. She'd been ready for this moment, longing for it, in a way. It was the first real challenge since that terrible night, the first time she'd need to prove she wasn't just a grieving widow but a force to be reckoned with. The three men rode with the confidence of those who believed they owned the territory. They laughed loudly, spurred on by their ignorance of the woman standing in their path. "Easy money," the tallest one sneered, glancing at the others. "Let's take what's hers and send a message." Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but hard. "This land is mine. You'll leave it in one piece, or not at all." The men laughed again, raising their weapons. It was a challenge, pure and simple. Time slowed. Sarah's breath steadied. Her hand moved to her revolver, smooth and sure. The first shot cracked like lightning. The leader's horse reared, startled, and the man stumbled as Sarah's bullet caught his shoulder. Chaos erupted. The second rider aimed, but Sarah was faster. She fired again, the bullet knocking the gun from his hand. The third man hesitated, eyes wide with shock, and Sarah's final shot sent him tumbling to the ground. The dust settled. Sarah stood alone, revolver smoking in her hand. They thought a widow alone was an easy mark. They thought wrong. Word of Sarah's courage spread like wildfire. From the small town nearby to the farthest homesteads, people told the tale of the widow who outdrew three men and lived to tell the tale. But Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. Crawford, the gang leader, was angry. He wouldn't tolerate a woman who challenged his rule. He sent threats, messages written in blood and fire. But Sarah didn't flinch. She doubled down on her training, practicing with fierce determination. The revolver became an extension of her will. Every shot fired a declaration. Her loneliness was now her strength. She wasn't just protecting land. She was rewriting the rules, sharpening the edge. The mornings came early and cold, the sky still wrapped in the dark blue hush before dawn. Sarah was already outside, revolver in hand, eyes fixed on the weathered wooden targets she'd set up along the fence line. The steady thud of bullets hitting wood was her morning song. Every shot was a promise to Jacob, to herself, to the land she had sworn to protect. At first, the revolver felt heavy and unfamiliar, like an unwelcome stranger. But with each day, it became a part of her, an extension of her own will and resolve. She practiced drawing it fast, steadying her aim, and firing with precision. Neighbors started to notice the change in her. The quiet widow was transforming into something new, something dangerous. At the market one afternoon, she overheard men talking in hushed tones. "She's training like a gunslinger," one whispered. "Faster than most I've seen." Sarah didn't respond. She kept her head low, her mind focused on the next challenge. Nights were spent poring over maps and old records, learning the terrain, plotting out escape routes, and predicting where Crawford's gang might strike next. She knew brute force wouldn't be enough. She needed strategy. Slowly, Sarah built a network of allies, fellow ranchers who had suffered from Crawford's men. Outcasts who understood the value of fighting back. They shared information, warned each other of trouble, and, most importantly, respected Sarah's growing reputation. She found strength not just in her gun, but in community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, Sarah sat by the fire with her new friends. The conversation was quiet, but full of determination. "We're tired of being pushed around," a grizzled old rancher said. "It's time someone stood up." Sarah looked around the firelight, her eyes steady. "Then it'll be me." The words hung in the air like a vow. Her resolve was tested soon enough. One night, a group of Crawford's men came to the homestead, hoping to catch her off guard, but Sarah was ready. She and her allies had laid traps and prepared an ambush. Gunfire lit up the night sky. Shots rang out, horses whinnied, and men shouted. When the dust settled, Sarah stood victorious once again. But she knew the war was far from over. Her transformation was complete. No longer just a widow, she was a protector, a fighter, the fastest gun in the territory in the making. And she would stop at nothing to keep her home. The widow's name spreads. The sun hung high over the town of Red Creek as Sarah McCall rode through the dusty main street. Heads turned and whispers followed in her wake. She wasn't just the widow now, she was a force. The fastest gun in the territory, they said. The woman who'd bested outlaws and stood tall where others faltered. For months, Sarah had fought tooth and nail to keep her land, facing threats, ambushes, and betrayals. Each victory had strengthened her name, and with it, the respect and fear of those around her. At the general store, the barkeep nodded solemnly as she passed. "Morning, Mrs. McCall," he said, voice low but sincere. "Heard you ran off Crawford's boys again." She tipped her hat. "They won't stop coming." "Neither will I." The townsfolk's attitudes shifted. Some still doubted her, still whispered that a woman's place was behind a stove, not a gun. But those whispers grew quieter, drowned out by tales of her speed and skill. At the saloon, a group of men traded stories of her latest showdown, their voices tinged with awe. "She's quick," one said, "quicker than any man I've met." A few nodded in agreement, reluctant respect etching their faces. But with growing fame came new dangers. Crawford's gang, humiliated and angry, intensified their efforts. They sent spies, tried to bribe her allies, and even attempted to burn the homestead down. Sarah's world grew darker, the stakes higher, yet she held firm, relying on her skill, her friends, and her unbreakable spirit. One evening, a rider galloped into Red Creek with a message for Sarah. It was from Crawford himself. "Give up the land, or die." Sarah read the note by firelight, her jaw tightening. She knew this was more than a threat, it was a challenge. She folded the paper carefully, then stepped outside into the night, her revolver gleaming under the stars. "This ends soon," she whispered to the wind. Showdown at dawn revised. The first gray light of dawn stretched across the barren plains, casting long shadows over Sarah McCall's homestead. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of sage and dust and something darker, something waiting. Sarah stood alone, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Her revolver rested at her hip, cold steel against worn leather. Years of loss, fear, and determination had hardened her. This wasn't just a fight for land anymore. It was a fight for her very soul. From the ridge, she spotted the approaching dust cloud, swirling like a storm on the horizon. Crawford's gang was coming, men who thrived on fear and violence, convinced they could break the widow who dared defy them. The ground trembled beneath the thunder of hooves as the outlaws drew near, faces grim, eyes burning with hatred. Sarah's breath was steady, her fingers flexed, ready. The first shots cracked sharply, breaking the silence like thunder. Sarah moved with a quiet fury, each bullet fired with deadly purpose. She was a force of nature, swift, unyielding, precise. Men fell, one after another, but Crawford charged on, his expression cold, a predator unwilling to accept defeat. They met at the heart of the homestead, eyes locked in a deadly dance. Time seemed too slow, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Crawford's hand twitched. His gun was out first, a flash of steel and a roar. But Sarah was faster. Her revolver spoke before his. A single shot ringing true. Crawford's body slumped, the fight leaving his eyes. The gang scattered, defeated and broken. Sarah lowered her gun, the dawn casting her long shadow over the land she'd fought so hard to save. She was no longer just a widow, she was legend. Legacy of the fastest gun. The sun set slowly over the territory, casting a golden glow on the land Sarah McCall had fought to protect. Years had passed since the final showdown with Crawford's gang, but the memory of that day and the woman who stood against the odds remained etched in every corner of the territory. Sarah had changed. The quiet widow was gone, replaced by a woman forged in fire and grit, a legend whispered in saloons and around campfires. Her name carried weight, respect from townsfolk, wary acknowledgement from outlaws, and a quiet pride in her own heart. She never sought fame or fortune. The land was her home, and that was enough. The homestead flourished under her care. The scars of battle faded, replaced by new life, fields of grain waving in the breeze, cattle grazing peacefully, and a house filled with the warmth of hard-earned peace. Visitors came and went, often leaving with stories of the widow who became the fastest gun in the territory, a woman who refused to be broken, who met violence with courage, and who changed the rules for everyone who came after. Sarah often stood on her porch at sunset, watching the horizon. The sky was vast, endless, like the future she'd carved out for herself. She thought of Jacob, the man who'd taught her strength, and of the promise she'd made to protect, to survive, to never surrender. In the town nearby, a new generation grew up hearing her story. Young boys and girls dreamed of courage and justice. Inspired by the widow who'd become more than anyone expected, Sarah's legacy wasn't just in her quick draw or fierce resolve, it was in the spirit she inspired. One evening, as the stars began to sprinkle the sky, Sarah placed her revolver carefully on the mantle, a symbol of battles fought and won. She smiled softly, knowing that while her gun might one day rest, the story of the fastest gun in the territory would live on, because some legends never fade.